thought was a really good segue, because essentially what I want to talk about today is the innate healing response of the body and how we ultimately facilitate that. And I really just want to provide a perspective today that I believe, once fully realized, really will revolutionize medicine. And that word's kind of funny because I don't have a TV at home. I'm watching a TV in my hotel room, and there's all kinds of commercials for pharmaceuticals that are revolutionizing the treatment of this disease or that disease. And that word gets used a lot, but in reality, there hasn't been a revolution in modern medicine since the late 1800s, early 1900s, when we had the development of antibiotics and the germ theory. And so what we really are talking about with revolution in medicine is a revolution of thought and thinking. And I would start with just this concept that is sort of the gateway that we cannot heal another human being. It's our own innate healing capability that accomplishes this. We can do so many things to intervene and support it, but as healing practitioners, we're ultimately facilitating healing. There's no drug or supplement or procedure or technology that can make it happen. I'm going to use this example to just first illustrate what I'm going to talk about. How many of you have done a polar plunge before? Anybody have jumped in cold water? A few of you. Yeah, you're from the north, so you've done it. Yeah, so it's kind of an amazing experience. You expect you're going to jump into this water and get out and you're going to be freezing cold. But you jump in here and you stay in here for 10 seconds, and how do you feel when you get out, actually, within 30 seconds? You feel pretty invigorated. You're actually warm because your body adapts to the coldness. It says, this is cold, I need to warm up. And so you get a physiologic response. And this is just an example that illustrates sort of a superpower that we have as human beings, is our ability to adapt to stress. So you may have heard of the term homeostasis, and we all probably learned that in growing up in grade school in science, but that's not really an accurate term because it kind of gives you an idea of some fixed set point. In research, they talk about allostasis, and this is more of, there's a set point, but we're kind of doing this dance. We're dynamic beings, and this is true of all biology. And there's consistently stress and adaptation going on in any organism. And so allostasis has decided to stay around the set point, and its healthy functioning requires continual adjustments of the internal physiologic milieu. And it may seem like that happens when we jump into cold water, like the example, right? But you're doing this right now, all day, every day. You have to, or you wouldn't be alive very long. There's bacteria all over your skin and your sinuses and your intestines that you're adapting to in order to stay at this sort of around the set point of health. Viruses all over in your gut and sinuses and the air in here. Temperature, we have to, if I crank the heat up in here, you're going to have to adapt in some way. Maybe it's behavioral, but there's physiologic change. But what about mental and emotional? Anticipatory stress, worry, stressful work, all of those sorts of things. That's a major stressor to us, right? Or another one that I think about, I've seen so many people over the years who have been caretakers for loved ones. And anybody who's done that knows how much of a stress that can be, right? It can be a common cause for burnout. And then grief. Most of us have experienced just the deep pain of loss and grief and know how long of a process that can be, right? To heal from that and get back to a place of maybe normal functioning even. And it doesn't matter if we're talking about a virus or a bacteria or a mental emotional stressor or any of the other things that are going on right now that you don't perceive. The end result, if we don't adapt to any of those stressors, is disease. This is what disease is. And so in this model, the arrows are stressors, and the little T's here are the person pushing back, adapting to the multitude of stressors in their environment. And with maybe exception of some certain types of genetic diseases, this is true of all disease. At its foundation, you can understand it from this model. But if this is disease, it's also kind of empowering to realize this is healing. This is all it is when we heal, as we begin to overcome the stressor. And it's easy to see those things, especially in acute diseases. We get the flu, we get sick, that is an inability to adapt immediately, but we get better from the flu, and that getting better is the adaptive mechanisms of the body. It's the innate healing mechanisms. So in this model of disease and healing, the allostasis is staying around the set point, but from a chronic illness perspective, research talks about allostatic overload, and so this is basically the stressors are so much on the system for so long that the chronic exposure to those stressors and the chronic need to adapt has a cost. And so we get maladaptation and dysfunction in systems, but it doesn't have to be chronic, right? I just used the example of the flu, and that's sort of an immediate example that we all understand, I think. So I wanted to just read a quote here. If we're going to consider what is healing, I think we should consider what's our job as health practitioners, physicians. And there was this really brilliant physician at the turn of the 17th century, and his name was Samuel Hahnemann, and he wrote this amazing book called The Organon of Medicine. And the first sentence in the book says, "The physician's high and only mission is to restore the sick to health, to cure, as it is termed." The second sentence then says, "The highest ideal of cure is rapid, gentle, and permanent restoration of health, or removal and annihilation of the disease in its whole extent, in the shortest, most reliable, and most harmless way on easily comprehensible principles." And I love that, and I think that any of us in the healthcare professions, this is what we're striving to do. So if that's what we're trying to do, what's the real question then? If we know what disease is and healing is from this model, then the question is, for all of us, how do we help people go from this to this? And modern medicine pretty much acts on where the arrows are. Modern medicine acts on the products of disease. Modern medicine is quite good at removing some stressors, especially if you think about microbes. That's why antibiotics work so incredibly when they're needed, because the major stressor at the moment is this bacteria, and antibiotics can remove that bacteria so that the body's innate healing mechanisms can take over, right? So most of modern medicine works out here, doesn't focus too much on the person and the adaptive responses. Probably the best it does is the replenishment of nutrients. If they're depleted, then a lot of healing mechanisms can't work. So we're also good at identifying and depleting those things, but inside here is where we have really not focused very much. So I want to introduce you to this concept in medicine and pharmacology called a dose-response curve. And all it is that over here on the y-axis, as you go up, it's the response to any substance that you would put in a body or test as a medicine. And as the response goes up, the toxicity goes up, basically. And over here on the y-axis, you have the dose. So it makes sense. As the dose goes up, it becomes more toxic. That probably makes sense to all of us. So what they want to do in pharmacology historically, and still what they do typically, is reduce the dose to where there's a low observed adverse effect level, and then there's a no observed adverse effect level. So that's no symptoms, no side effects. So there's no adverse effect. That's kind of the sweet spot where they want a medication, right? They don't want too many side effects, but they want to have a sort of physiologic response, which is, technically a toxic response based on this curve. And then what's interesting is you get down to the bottom, a true no observed effect level, meaning you get to a point, a dose, where there's just no observed effect. And this is what pharmacology and pharmaceuticals, the pharmaceutical industry has based their business on for at least 100 years. And they've functioned on the idea that as you go, you have a true no observed effect, and as you go down, there's still just no observed effect. There's just one problem, that this is not true. This is completely false. This is actually what a dose response curve looks like. And this is inverted, so now instead of getting more toxic as you go up, you get less toxic and more health. Down would be toxic, so you're seeing as the dose goes up, here, this is the toxicity. So as the dose goes up, it's more and more toxic. And they're using the term here, this is a Hormetic research paper, so they're calling it a stressor, because that's what it really is, right? Substance is so stressful that it becomes toxic. Where it crosses the x-axis would be the no observed effect, but if you keep decreasing the dose, you don't just have no observed effect, you actually have the opposite effect. You actually start to see a stimulatory response, which is called a hormetic response. So this is called hormesis. This idea that something at high doses that's toxic is actually beneficial at lower doses. And this is very well accepted now in biology. Over the last 20 years, there's been a lot of research into hormesis. And they're just showing examples of toxins, radiation, fasting, pathogens, anything can be a stressor to the body. And they're showing, and it makes sense that any stressor to a certain dose, it may be deleterious and cause illness and disease. But if we decrease that dose down to a level where now it's not toxic, the body just perceives it as a stressor and it adapts to it. And so you actually get a strengthening. And so you'll see one of the things I have is longevity. What research really clearly shows is that you expose organisms to radiation. There's been a lot of research on radiation. Well, we all know that radiation can be deadly, right? But if you decrease the dose of radiation, the longevity and the lifespan of the organism actually will increase. And you can get an increase in 30 to 60% of normal function using the hormetic response. So I just put some things you might consider as stressors here. But it's not just us. This is all biology. Every biological organism has to respond continually to its environment. And I learned this in evolutionary biology in undergraduate school. My teacher, he would talk about fitness, but he said ultimately it's adaptation at the end of the day. If an organism and a species can't adapt, then it doesn't survive. It's true on a species ecology level, it's true on an individual level. Okay, so now that we know this is like a true dose response curve, what I want to point out is that modern medicine is focused, this is where we've been focusing for 150 years, is in the red circle here. We've been focusing on that first dose response curve, and not until the last 20 years have we started researching what happens where the green circle is. We've gotten into a silo, basically, in science and research, looking at what we can do to influence physiology through what would be really considered a toxic sort of response to the body. And this has led us down the scientific process of reductionism. It hasn't always been this way. Especially in the 1800s, there was still a lot of thought and practice of people who were practicing holism with herbal medicine and other types of medicine. And then there was sort of a reductionist camp. And really when we got the germ theory and microscopes and then more and more ability to see smaller and smaller and smaller, that's reductionist, saying that we'll find the cause of disease in being able to see smaller and smaller, and DNA and epigenetics and all these things. And it's not a right or wrong. They're both true and they're both extremely valuable in their own way. But if this caused the first revolution in medicine, I really wonder what might happen over here. But this idea of hormesis, and we've known about this, by the way, for 150, 200 years. It just sort of got disparaged. The idea of using low doses for the stimulatory response, it got disparaged by the reductionist camp, and it got left behind and didn't get researched anymore. But we're seeing a resurgence, but this idea of hormesis in itself is not going to revolutionize medicine. What I want to talk about that I think will is using this concept in a very targeted and personalized way. So this is kind of the perspective I want to give you. I find this very fascinating to think about it this way because it starts to flip your thinking about using medicines and how we use medicines. So imagine you have a disease with A through F are the physiologic mechanisms that are causing that disease. Modern medicine, we would want to know, how do we address products of the disease process? How do we go in here and stop F from happening, stop D from happening, right? That sort of thing. But what if we're thinking about how we stimulate the healing capabilities of the body? Then we're wondering something more like this. We want to use something that at high doses would be toxic to these mechanisms, except we want to decrease the dose down so that those same systems that are involved in the disease are just experience enough of a same or similar stressor they start to strengthen and adapt. Does that kind of make sense, what I'm saying? Okay. And this changes everything, because if you think now about any disease, Crohn's disease, instead of going in, because we know that's an autoimmune-driven disease, a ton of inflammation in the GI tract. And now we would go in and currently we would go in and suppress the immune system and call that the cause of the disease. But from this other perspective of using a hormetic response, we're actually wanting to know what are the mechanisms driving the disease, and how do we actually facilitate an adaptive response from those mechanisms, because adaptation is healing, right? I've already kind of given examples of that. And so it's the same thing with any kind of disease. If we can strengthen the dysregulated systems, then we might start to see healing of the many chronic diseases that the reductionist medical model just can't solve. There's things it's amazing at, and there's things it's not. And if you think about this for a little bit, the next logical question you'll come up with is, okay, that makes sense. How do I know what medicine is going to stimulate this disease? This is where I think it gets really interesting and sort of exciting to think about. So I put a toxin here, just instead of calling it toxin X, just to give it a name, I used arsenic. Most of us are familiar with that, as a toxic substance. So arsenic up here is toxic, and it's toxic because it impacts particular physiologic mechanisms of the body. We decrease the dose to where we start to get this hormetic response. It's still impacting the same physiologic mechanisms. It's just not so powerful that it's overcoming their adaptive capability. Does that make sense? This is impacting X, Y, and Z physiologic process, and it's toxic. If you decrease the dose, it's still impacting X, Y, and Z physiologic process. It's just not toxic to it now. You're getting a stimulatory response. And so, if you want to know what sort of medicine might be able to help, let's say, Crohn's disease, if Crohn's disease has the mechanisms X, Y, and Z that are driving the disease and they're dysregulated, if you have a substance, arsenic, I'm not saying arsenic cures Crohn's disease, but just for example, if arsenic in its toxic dose impacts X, Y, and Z, then you just need to use a lower dose of arsenic maybe, or any substance, right, that impacts those same systems. But you just use it at a lower dose so that you're not overcoming those systems, you're actually stimulating a response. Does that kind of make sense? You just want something that can hit the same points, but you just need, but then you also need to realize what sort of dose you need. I don't remember why I threw that extra slide in. I was probably going to say something. I wasn't sure who the audience would be, so I put some stuff in here about research, because there's a lot of research we need to do. But as you can see, this really kind of applies to all of us as human beings. But I think new research designs, we need reductionistic and holistic sorts of models of research methodologies, and the current scientific paradigm is very good at the reductionistic molecular biology, cell biology, genetics, etc., those sorts of methodologies. This wouldn't be that much different for them for researchers to start to get their head around, okay, we need to look at this substance. It normally, has these effects, and try it in diseases where those same areas are impacted, but just change their methodologies to a dose that's stimulatory, because it's just a totally different goal. It's a completely different thing that we're trying to accomplish. But this is my example of a holistic mindset for doing research design. So all the X's are physiologic mechanisms of a disease. These are all the things, and there's tons more, because we are immensely complex organisms. And so it's a constellation of things going on in our body with any disease. You could try, and currently science would try, to figure out all of those things, and they would say, oh, let's impact that X and that X and that X, and then maybe the symptoms will decrease, and maybe the person will have a better quality of life, and those sorts of things. And you can go about it in that way and have impact, But the other way to look at it from a holistic perspective, and this is what people in traditional Chinese medicine and Ayurveda and in many other traditional medicines do, is they look at the symptom picture as the manifestation of the constellation of all the things going on in the body. They're not saying what's going on with this, this immune pathway, this biochemical pathway, and et cetera. They're astutely observing the characteristics of a symptom picture and saying, these signs and symptoms are going on, and viewing that as a manifestation of kind of the sum of all the parts, if you will, right? And I kind of think of it as if you had a supercomputer, you might think AI could help with this, but it's only going to be as good as the input that you put into it, right? So even if you could imagine putting all of these things in, we're never going to probably know all of the inputs that would be needed to get the output from a computer algorithm of exactly what we need to do to stimulate the healing process. But this body that we're in is a supercomputer. This body that we're in gives you the output. It's already got all the inputs. It's already got all the X. The output is what we can observe. It's the symptom picture. So, being that, this could be a disease process with a certain symptom picture, you could also imagine using a toxic substance like arsenic, and it impacts all kinds of things in the body. And when you give up arsenic, you ultimately get a symptom picture. It's like an artificial disease, essentially, that you're imprinting upon the body by giving them this substance. So, a holistic way to maybe look at this and start to research it, besides like what I was saying about the reduction side of it, is to say, what's the symptom picture that a substance produces? If I give arsenic, what are the characteristics of that substance that it produces in the body? Because a disease that produces the same kind of symptom picture, they have to be acting on very similar physiologic mechanisms. The disease could not produce the same symptom picture as arsenic or any other substance unless the very, very similar systems were being impacted. Okay? So I think that where research needs to go is start to also look at this holistic picture and realize the minute details matter, but so does the overall presentation, because that's how we can actually observe the disease in a valuable and just different way, but with no less utility. And I think that really, when we can start to look at what I'm talking about today in research and practice, we're going to have a real whole framework of health and healing, and what disease is, what healing is, and a whole new toolbox of medicine to practice. We won't only have what's on this side of the circle. We'll have all these other things, and it will be actually a whole view of what it means to be human and how we can facilitate healing processes. Because imagine when you can remove stressors really well, and dysfunctional products of disease, etc., and you can stimulate the healing responses of the body. Imagine what we can do. So that's the talk that I have.
Wow. Thank you so much, Dr. Myers. That was very interesting.